The letter came back unopened, returned to sender. In the dust-choked town of Red Hollow, word spread fast. The mail-order bride was sent away before she even stepped off the coach. All because she wasn't what he'd imagined. Too soft, too round, too much of everything the frontier didn't value. But one man saw her differently. Beneath the weight of rejection, he saw strength, warmth, and a heart made for surviving the wild. When his eyes met hers, the story of her worth began again, one heartbeat against the wind. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The envelope buckled in the sheriff's clerk's palm, sun-faded paper, the red stamp pronounced, "Return to sender," and already the town had a verdict. Because Red Hollow loved a short, clean story more than it loved people, the wind took that sentence and flung it down Maine like a gauntlet. The coach rolled in on a ribbon of dust, coachman tipped hat, horses steaming, and Martha Lynn stepped down as the wood creaked under her weight and the world tilted to meet her. She was massive, massive not like a threat but like a landscape, broad and unashamed, dark brown hair falling in long, voluminous waves that framed a face both open and wary, the kind of face that had learned to count small mercies. Her travel dress was pale cream, a bodice cut to a V that tried to shape what the world refused to accommodate. A neat line of little buttons down the center, and a straw bonnet sat on her crown, round, modest, ribbon tied under her chin like a promise, tails of ribbon falling over the front of her bodice. Her skin was light and freckled where sun met luck, and her hands trembled just enough for anyone looking closely to know she had held her breath for days. Samuel Pike stood with his back to her, a man who had placed an order in ink and paper and then recoiled from the living answer. He turned away before she could speak, the motion small and final, as though refusal were a thing that could be buttoned up and folded away. That turn, swift, ashamed, was a clean cut in the day. Gossip is a hungry animal. It smells blood and multiplies. Whispers threaded through the saloon and along the boardwalk. Not what he ordered. Too soft for the range. Ain't the kind that'd sit pretty by the stove and tend to a house. She'd eat more than he bargained for. The words were cruel in their plainness, the kind of cruelty that passes as practical counsel. Martha felt them like wind in her teeth. She felt them and measured them and folded them into herself the way a homemaker folds linens, neatly, without letting them show. Her heart beat an honest, loud rhythm beneath the fitted bodice. She swallowed the ache and lifted her chin. The town watched with the cruel patience of spectators at a slow show. Children, taught by the grown-ups' hush, peered from behind barrels. Men spat tobacco with the judge of a jury. The land itself seemed to turn its face. Yet in that same drift of dust and spy there was a different eye, a single man whose glance cut against the current. He stood at the back of the saloon, shadowed by a doorway, not mocking. He watched not the shape but the way the woman held herself when the world refused to hold her back. For Martha, every small detail felt like an accusation or a small mercy. The crease in her glove, the way the ribbon settled against her collarbone, the steadying of her breath. Samuel's refusal was more than embarrassment. It was a translation of fear into action. He feared the difference, and his fear became a public ritual of dismissal. People like that made quick judgments and expected the world to agree. Martha had known rejection before, had tasted it in letters that never arrived in time, in wagons that left without her. But this particular return to sender felt ceremonial. It marked her as an object, a wrong order in a marketplace of people, and it stung because it was public. Still, she stood when the coach's dust settled, shoulders wide beneath the bonnet, dignity folded into the layers of her dress. She did not weep in the street. She did not scream. She only tucked the crumpled edges of the returned letter into the pocket of her skirt and walked with the quiet certainty of someone who has nowhere to go but forward. Around her the town's murmurs rose and fell like the wind, insistent, small, but beneath that noise a quieter thing took root, the sense that something in the story had been left out, that in the space where shame had fallen there might be an opening for another gaze, another judgment, another chance. The town of Red Hollow had a way of turning private moments into public currency, and tonight the currency was cruelty. The saloon doors swung wide and the laugh that started their move down Main like a blade, sharp, practiced, handed from mouth to mouth until even the lamplight seemed complicit. Lamp glow catching sneers, the curl of a lip, the slow narrowing of eyes. They mocked the size of her body as if weight were a moral failing, as if flesh could be read like bad handwriting. And every chuckle was a small verdict returned on the stamped envelope still folded in her hand. Martha Lynn stood at the coach stop with that letter crumpled in the pocket of her pale cream travel dress, the fitted bodice tightening over a heart that beat louder than the Snickers, dark brown hair falling in long, voluminous waves across her shoulders, the straw bonnet tied under her chin with a wide cream ribbon whose tails lay like a remnant of hope against the V-shaped waistline and row of small buttons. Her skin was light, her cheeks held a faint bloom not of shame but of resolve, and she breathed slow and deep to keep the tears from coming where they could be read. Children, taught by the grown-ups' whispers, darted glances like small animals and then looked away. The blacksmith spat once and turned his hammer over in his palm like a judge weighing a sentence. The barber stopped mid-sweep to watch as if the dust itself had turned into theater. Their words had weight, too soft, too much to feed, not hearty enough for the ranch, and they stuck to her like grit. Yet within that chorus of dismissal there was a counterpoint, one set of eyes that did not drop to measure, did not flinch at the size of a body, but lingered on posture and steadiness. They were patient eyes, the kind that had watched sunrises and seen how light changes a man's face, the kind that noticed the small corrections a woman makes when she adjusts her bonnet as if to armor herself against the day. Martha felt the town's gaze like winter on bare skin, felt the heat of it, and the weight pressed her inward, and she chose, deliberately, like a steady hand threading a needle, to not give them the satisfaction of a breakdown. She folded her grief as neatly as the way she kept her skirt's hem, tucked the returned letter away into the inner pocket where paper could not be read by other hands, and she set her chin so that her bonnet shadow softened her face, making her look older than she felt and somehow more composed. The narrative being spun around her was plain and filthy, an order returned, a mistake acknowledged. There was a simplicity to their judgment, the way a lazy man preferred as a short answer to a hard truth. But Martha carried other stories in the lines at the corners of her mouth, histories that did not fit into the neat gossip of Red Hollow, letters unanswered, train stations left at dawn, a mother's lullaby hummed under breath, and those stories kept her upright. The saloon laughter ebbed and rose, a tide of small cruelties, and with each swell she steadied herself. There was a rhythm to her breathing now, a small drumbeat that matched the far-off hoofbeats of a rancher's horse. And for all their certainty, the townsfolk had not yet named the most important thing, that rejection could be returned, but a life, her life, could not be stamped and sent back. In the doorway, partly swallowed by shadow, the man with the different eyes watched her, not a spectacle but his presence. He did not look away at the mockery, but he did not join it either. His silence was not emptiness but on a red page. That quiet attention changed the geometry of the square for a moment. Where every face tilted in contempt, there was finally a face that tilted in thought, an unseen hand pointing at a crack in the town's tidy story. Martha noticed him then, just as he noticed the way her hands folded the letter and the slight tremor she refused to reveal, and something like a fragile agreement passed between them. She would not be reduced to the sum of other people's words, and he would not let those words alone define her. The whispering of Red Hollow continued, mean, small, relentless, but beneath it a different current moved, slow as the river under ice, the sense that the story had not ended when the envelope stamped returned to sender hit the clerk's palm. It had, in truth, only begun. Eli Carter sat in the far corner of the saloon like a knot of rope left over from some long-ago job, weathered, coiled, useful and unreadable, and he watched the room the way a man who has learned to read weather watches the sky, not for gossip's quick eddies, but for the slow changes that tell storms from passing clouds. He was the sort of man Red Hollow assigned to silence, a jaw carved by years of hawk-like decisions, hands browned and scarred from leather and rope, a coat that smelled faintly of saddle soap and old rain, and eyes that measured distance and difficulty with the same flat, honest look he reserved for fences and horses. He had lost more than townsfolk ever guessed, a wife taken by fever before the town had time to form a proper memory of her, a war that hammered the light out of his smile, afternoons that stacked into a solitude he wore like winter clothing. Yet he did not complain of any of it. He simply picked up what needed picking up and left the rest for the crows. When Martha Lynn stepped down from the coach in her pale cream travel dress, The V-shaped bodice, a neat line of small buttons doing what clothes could do to make order where life had been messy. Her massive body moving with a dignity the town misunderstood. Eli noticed her the way a man notices a reliable gate that will not creak, first as fact, then as promise. Her dark brown hair rolled in long, voluminous waves around her face and over her shoulders, the straw bonnet perched with a modest brim, the cream ribbon tied under her chin, and a simple bow whose tails fell against the front of her bodice like a quiet claim. Her skin was light and held a map of small freckled histories, and though the saloon's laughter cut and curled like a blade through lamplight, he saw something in her stance that no derision could alter. It was not pity that moved him. Pity is a loud, clumsy thing, and Eli's life had taught him that loudness seldom helps mending, but rather recognition, that odd, fierce kinship born of knowing what it means to be judged by absence and loss, to be measured by what one lacks rather than what one carries. He saw the way she folded her hands around the returned letter, the slight set of her shoulders against the wind of whispers, and in that small, stubborn posture he read a history of refusals that resembled his own. A war that refused to let go, a wife that left a shape in the house, a future that was expected to be smaller than a man dared hope for. Around him the town practiced its usual cruelties, the blacksmith's chuckle, the barkeep's smirk, but Eli's attention cut across the noise like a blade of light. He noticed the steadiness in her breath, the soft, deliberate way she placed one foot before another as if testing ground for courage, and in that noticing something shifted inside him. An old lock opened a little. He had been a man who kept his life to necessary facts: hay needs stacking, fences mended, horses fed. He had filed grief into drawers and labeled it with dates and dosages of work. He had convinced himself solitude was a kind of strength. But Martha's presence was an argument against such tidy thinking. She wore her size like a landscape wears its hills, unchosen and intrinsic, and the sight of her simply being there, unashamed, unclipped by the town's small minds, felt like the first honest weather in a long season. The recognition was not romantic at once. It was moral, primitive, the human impulse to stand with another who stands alone. Eli's own heartbreak had taught him the cruelty of quick judgments, so when he watched her stand beneath the lamplight, bonnet's shadow softening her face, he could not join the laughter. Instead, he kept his silence, which in a town of talkative men was itself a kind of witness. He saw more than size. He saw a woman whose hands trembled with hope and who did not let that tremor turn into supplication. He saw someone whose work-worn eyes had the capacity to care for a life that needed care. In that shaded corner, behind a glass of whiskey he scarcely touched, Eli felt the first stirrings of something like obligation and curiosity braided together. The obligation of a man who had known loss to test himself against a new kind of risk, and the curiosity to learn what a story looked like when you stopped reading it from the cover and opened it up. The saloon's laughter echoed and died against rafters. Outside, the wind moved dust in the street, and inside Eli's chest, worn and quiet, a different rhythm began, a soft, careful attention that would, in time, change the slope of both their days. No room would take her. Red Hollow's kindness had margins and a ceiling, and when the boarding house keeper, a woman with a ledger face and a mercy measured in coin, slid her palm in the air and said, "Can't afford another mouth," the words landed like a verdict, economical and cold. Martha Lynn moved through the town like a question the town did not want to answer, massive in body but not in presence, dark brown hair falling in long, voluminous waves that framed a face with kind eyes and hands that had kept a household and a hope intact through worse weather than this. Her travel dress, pale cream and modest, the fitted bodice and V-shaped waistline buttoned down the front, bonnet tied with a wide cream ribbon under her chin, looked like the best she could present to an uncertain world. She carried the return letter folded into her pocket like a map that led nowhere. She carried also the small dignity of a woman who has practiced standing when there is nothing left to lean on. The general store's porch was colder than its boards looked, and that night under a scatter of stars she wrapped herself in a blanket borrowed from the clerk, because charity in Red Hollow came cheaper than a bed, and she listened to the town breathing as if the buildings themselves kept judgment. She tried not to think of the coach's wheels, of Samuel Pike's turned back. She tried not to think of every face in the saloon that had smoothed into mockery the moment the envelope read returned to sender. Instead, she traced with her thumb the crease of the paper and felt the stubbornness of living. Even the rejected letter was still a thing that existed, and existence is a kind of argument. The night made small noises, rats, the wind in the hitching posts, the low creak of a sign, and Martha held each one like a metronome, measuring a time that might, in its own way, count towards something else. She did not sleep much because she had the habit of keeping watch. Loss had taught her to wake and listen for the next step, the next decision, and against the deep hush she imagined the future as a thin line of light that might be found if you walked until the road changed. Dawn slid pale over the roofs and the town's first movements were practical and merciless. A baker's cart, a child's shout, a dog that needed its business taken care of. Eli Carter found her before the baker could ask who she was. He found her with no drama. He had the quiet, approaching way of a man used to reading land and weather, and when he stepped onto the porch there was no offer of pity on his face, only a question that was itself small but enormous in consequence. "You eat breakfast yet?" His boots settled into the dust as though they had something to do, which they had. He had a ranch that needed work and a solitude he had kept like a stone. Martha looked at him. The light making the ribbon beneath her chin gleamed faintly, and for a moment she measured him as she had been measured by others, waiting for the thread of mockery. Instead, Eli's eyes were a slow thing. They assessed, not to mete out shame, but to learn shape and need. He did not smile. He did not speak kindness as if it were a coin to be traded for gratitude. He simply offered the practical. Even the plainness of the offer was a kind of shelter she had not expected. It was not a rescue so much as an invitation to be present in someone else's life in exchange for a place by his table. It accepted her as a worker and a person, not as a charity case, and that framed the choice in a way no one else in Red Hollow had bothered to do. She accepted with the slow caution of someone who has been disappointed by once dressed as promises, and as they moved toward the diner the town watched with its usual appetite for stories, not yet knowing that a small act, an offered plate, the sharing of bread, could change the arithmetic of how a life was counted. The diner smelled of coffee and hock grease in the small town's opinions, and Martha sat at the far end with her hands folded around a tin cup like someone holding a map that had been creased too many times. She was massive in a way that made doorways a matter of negotiation, dark brown hair and long, voluminous waves that fell across her shoulders. The pale cream travel dress fitted at the bodice with its V-shaped waistline and row of small buttons, the straw bonnet tied under her chin with a wide cream ribbon whose tails lay over her bodice like a quiet banner, and every eye in the room catalogued her the way man catalogued wind, by the way it would inconvenience them. So she ate slowly, each bite measured, the sounds of chewing amplified by the hush of judgment and the weight of the returned letter tucked into an inner pocket that felt like an accusation and a talisman at once. The lamplight cut flares across the counter, carving faces into halves, some amused, some scandalized, some merely curious, and the laughter from the saloon hours before still hung like a ghost at the edges of people's mouths. But Eli sat opposite her, not directly across as if setting a barrier, but at an angle where he could see the road through the window and the way light pooled on her bonnet, and his presence had the slow authority of a thing withered into being, a quiet that had been practiced like a craft. He did not speak to be kind. He spoke because speech was useful when it passed on simple facts. "You eat breakfast yet?" He had asked earlier on the porch, and when she nodded in that private, deliberate way people who have learned to survive do, she found the diner's coffee warmer, the biscuit heartier than she expected, and the eyes that had been measuring began, some of them, to shift in calculation, not out of newfound mercy but out of a practical curiosity about a woman who could hold her ground. The tension hummed between them like a wire under strain. It was not drama so much as the waiting that comes before action. The breath held across two bodies that had kept their histories like folded letters. In Eli's case, that history was a widow's silence and a war's muted claim on his face. In hers, it was a series of departures and a courage that had not yet been named by anyone in Red Hollow. When she reached for her coin, the square of brass and copper she had carried for small purchases, the old habit of paying for one's own survival, Eli's hand lifted in a small, unequivocal stop. No flourish, no sermon, save it. Roads long ahead. Those words, plain as they were, landed with a force that was not charity. There are kinds of giving that carry shame and kinds that carry respect, and Eli's was of the latter sort. It acknowledged her as a person who would work and who would be trusted to keep her place at the table because she had a place at the table, not because she was a spectacle or a problem. Across the counter, a man snorted and returned to his eggs. The barkeep watched the exchange with the slow arithmetic of a ledger. But something in the room had shifted, like light filling a room through a curtain, subtle, irrevocable. Martha's hands, broad and capable, trembled only a little as she accepted the plate. She kept her chin up so the bonded shadow softened her face rather than hid it, and in the way she arranged her napkin and folded the cutlery there was a kind of domestic choreography that Red Holler had mocked yet secretly relied on when sickness took a woman or when a man needed a warm plate after a night on the range. Eli did not ask for thanks. He did not demand covenant. He offered a practical arrangement instead. Work, food, a place to wake in the morning, and his silence around sentiment was a shelter that allowed Martha to accept without feeling diminished. The town's whispers ran like threads through the room, attempting to stitch her story into a cautionary tale. But against that patchwork of small cruelties an opening had appeared, an unremarkable man offering unremarkable help, which in Red Hollow's ledger felt almost revolutionary. She ate, and beneath the rhythm of her chewing a different narrative began to hum, one of steady labor, mutual reliance, and the slow unmaking of a dismissal stamped in red ink. Eli's quiet watchfulness and the simple refusal to let her pay created a small moral geography where dignity might grow. And when she left the diner later, shoulders a little straighter, the returned letter weighing the same in her pocket but feeling less like a verdict, the town saw the two of them, not as pity and pitied, but as a nascent arrangement, a pairing born from necessity and recognition, which is often how true things begin. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. Eli's offer arrived without fanfare, a plain sentence folded into the rhythm of morning. I need someone to keep accounts and tend to the animals. It's lonely land. You'll learn your stay. It was not the sort of line a man says when he wants to be admired. It was the kind he says when he's listing what must be done, and therein its dignity. Practical, unadorned, a promise stitched to necessity rather than pity. Martha stood with the returned letter still in the inner fold of her skirt, the pale cream of her travel dress catching the sun so that the V-shaped bodice and the small buttons down the center gleamed like punctuation on a sentence she had not written. Her dark brown hair rolled in long, voluminous waves that framed her face and tumbled over her shoulders beneath a straw bonnet whose modest brim made her eyes seem to look out from a small, deliberate shadow. The wide cream ribbon tied under her chin in a simple bow whose tails lay over her bodice like an emblem. Around them Red Hollow carried on with its clipped opinions, men and women assigning causes and punishments to one another as though life were a ledger and everything fit neatly in a column. But Eli's proposal refused that calculus. He spoke as a man who had learned to weigh work by its usefulness, ledgers to be kept straight, animals to be tended with hands that understood the language of pain and hunger, desks that require steadiness, not a pretty profile. He made no offer of charity. He made an offer of commerce between two lives, labor exchanged for board, presence exchanged for company, the quiet structure that a ranch imposes on those who live within its fences. Martha hesitated because she knew the look that often accompanied such offers, the soft pity that comes dressed as benevolence, the later fingers that count what was given and brand the recipient with obligation. She had lived enough itinerant years to mistrust anyone whose kindness asked for gratitude in advance. But Eli's face held no judgment. It held instead the steady calm of a man whose own losses had simplified his speech. There was no spectacle in his eyes, no curious measuring, only the flat, reliable appraisal of someone assessing work and weather. Can you do what needs doing? Do you show up? Can you keep a quiet watch? When he said, "You learn your stay," it had the ring of a covenant between two people who understood that dignity grows best in the soil of honest labor. The scene had the slow burn quality of those small frontier decisions that change a life not with fireworks but with repeated mornings. Martha listened, really listened, the way she had learned to listen to a baby's breathing when sickness made the night long. She heard in his voice the absence of condescension and the presence of practicality, and that difference weighed more than the coin in her pocket. She thought of the boarding house keeper's ledger and the saloon's laughter, of Samuel Pike's turn back and the returned envelope that had turned her into a lesson, and she let all of it fold into the choice before her like old papers into a new file. Accepting would mean work from dawn to dusk, mending fences, mending shirts, tending to the small ledgers of feed and seed, learning the names of horses and the moods of calves, and setting a place at a table that was small but honest. It would mean surrendering a certain anonymity, being seen for what she did rather than what she was. But it would also mean hands that recognize the worth of work rather than the worth of bodies. Eli's solitude, which he had curated like a weatherproof cloak, seemed to offer room instead of walls. The ranch was a kind of sanctuary, not because it was gentler, but because its rules were simple and its rewards measured in survival and small satisfactions. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, though there was a tremor under the syllables, part fatigue, part relief. "I'll come," she said, and the word landed between them like an agreement signed in ink indeed. The town watched, as it always did, waiting for scandal, for pity, for drama. Instead, it got the slow machinery of two people arranging the daily necessities of living. They walked toward Eli's wagon together, a deliberate, quiet procession, and in the cadence of their steps was already a beginning. The beginning of chores learned side by side, of evenings by the stove where stories would be swapped in low voices, of a relationship built not on a rescue but on mutual need and respect. In that acceptance there was a small, cinematic revelation, the kind the town could not script, that dignity could be reclaimed not by pleading but by labor, and that a man who saw what needed doing could offer a hand that did not bleed shame into the gesture. The ranch sat beneath an open sky that felt like a promise every morning, endless blue, thin clouds like brushstrokes, and wind that spoke in steady, practical rhythms. Eli's land was hard and honest, a place where work did not hide behind flourishes and where the day measured a person by what they did at dawn and dusk. Martha learned that language quick as a hand learns the braid of a rope. She rose with the first gray and moved through tasks with a careful, deliberate steadiness that made even small chores look like ceremonies. She swept the kitchen so the wood floor shone in a way that returned light to the room. She tended the pantry as if preserving items were a form of prayer. She mended shirts with stitches that would have done a fine seamstress proud. And when she fed the hens, she did it with the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had been given responsibility and treated it like trust. Her body was massive and present in a landscape that favored spare silhouettes. That presence changed the geometry of doorways and the arc of tool paths, but it never interfered with the grace of her movements. Dark brown hair fell in long, voluminous waves that framed her face and tumbled over her shoulders beneath a straw bonnet tied with a cream ribbon. The fitted bodice and V-shaped waistline and the neat row of small buttons keeping order where life often did not. And there was a quiet authority to the way she folded hay, to the way she poured water without spilling, to the way she counted feet and kept the ledger with ink that did not tremble. The first days passed in near silence. Mornings became a litany of chores and evenings a measured retreat by the stove where the two of them made from tin plates and did not speak much because words seemed superfluous when work had already said so much. Eli watched her from the distance of his chores, not in the intrusive way of a man who measures another by novelty, but with the kind of attention that reads rhythm. The way she hummed under her breath as she scrubbed a pan, the way she squared her shoulders when a fence needed mending, the way she stooped to lift with knees engaged rather than back strain. Small functional details that told him more about her character than any speech ever could. She, in turn, took measure of him the way one measures land, by the boundaries he keeps and the steadiness of his hands. She noticed how he moved around the barn with a familiarity that came from long hours and harmed no one. How his silence was not emptiness but the careful saving of words for moments that deserved them. There were nights when the wind came down from the hills like distant hoofbeats and the lanterns flickered. They would sit with their backs to the wood stove. The ranch was quiet, folding them both into its long, slow heart. And though conversation was sparse, it was meaningful when it came. An exchanged fact about the weather, a small complaint about a stubborn cold, a memory dropped like a stone into still water that caused ripples. The children from town, curious and fed on saloon talk, occasionally peered over the fence to see the new woman at work, and Martha, who had grown accustomed to being watched as if she were an exhibit, learned to let those glances pass like wind, not letting them determine how she held herself. Her laughter, when it came, a brief, bright sound, felt startlingly like clearing a cloud. It altered the ranch's atmosphere in small miraculous ways, as if her presence itself reset what the land expected of people. Eli's respect was not loud. It was the way he left the workbench tidy, the way he explained a task once and then let her do it in her style, the way he brought 2 mugs of coffee without comment and set one before her. Over days that became weeks, the ranch's silence turned companionable. Chores became shared rituals, and the rhythm of labor began to stitch two solitary lives into a pattern. The land did not forgive weakness easily, but it also did not reward posturing. It recognized utility, and in that recognition Martha found a dignity that turned the sting of Red Hollow's whispers into a distant ache rather than a defining sentence. In that wide, quiet place, under a sun they cared not for gossip. Both of them began to learn a new vocabulary, of trust that was earned in mornings and repaid in evenings, of attention that watched work rather than bodies, and of a slow, steady companionship that would, in time, rearrange what the town thought it knew about worth. The sky tore open without warning, a low, hungry roar that turned the quiet ranch into a throat of noise. Wind came like a thing with teeth, sweeping dust in sheets, snapping the line of the horizon and playing havoc with fences as if it were a restless god testing the metal of everything under it. Eli heard the first scream of the horses and knew by the cadence, raw and urgent, that the storm would not be a weather it could ride out with folded arms. He moved like a man whose body remembers peril before the mind does. Boots finding ground, he walked 1,000 times, voice cutting orders into the gusts that shredded sound into ragged pieces. The barn door slammed like a verdict and a post went loose, and for a moment the world narrowed to the immediacy of servile halters, frantic hooves, a colt that had tangled itself into the hitch. Martha was already there, the pale cream of her travel dress smeared with wind-driven grit, the V-shaped bodice and the neat row of small buttons outlined in a film of dust, dark brown hair in long, voluminous waves whipping from beneath the straw bonnet tied with its wide ribbon, her massive body a moving bastion against the chaos. She did not hesitate, where townsfolk might have counted and fled. She stepped into the horse's panic with arms that knew how to hold and hands that had tended more fragile lives than a colt's. The ribbon under her chin beat like a flag in the storm and she squinted against the grit, every motion measured and precise. She looped a rope with a practiced hand, anchored a frightened mare to a spare post with the calm of someone who has mended more than cloth, and she pushed where panic wanted only to pull. Eli watched, not surprised but unsettled in an old way. There is a particular kind of courage that is not loud, that does not announce itself with medals or speeches, and Martha's courage was of that sort, unceremonious, unshouting, a steadying force that did the work of bravery without asking anyone to witness it. Together they ran as the storm claimed the corrals, their movements complementary as if choreographed by necessity. Eli hauling a broken plank, Martha pressing a rope into hands that would otherwise have trembled. The fences that gave had to be rebuilt with hands slick from rain and sweat, and at one point a foal bolted toward the arroyo in her voice, sharp, commanding, cut through the wind, a human call that corralled wild motion into a path. In those minutes, when the ranch was a riot of terror and action, the town's old whisper about her size evaporated like dust in the rain. Muscle and will mattered more than measurements, and Martha's mass became leverage and a shelter. The sky tore open without warning, a low, hungry roar that turned the quiet ranch into a throat of noise. Wind came like a thing with teeth, sweeping dust in sheets, snapping the line of the horizon and playing havoc with fences as if it were a restless god testing the metal of everything under it. Eli heard the first scream of the horses and knew by the cadence, raw and urgent, that the storm would not be a weather it could ride out with folded arms. He moved like a man whose body remembers peril before the mind does. Boots finding ground, he'd walked 1,000 times, voice cutting orders into the gusts that shredded sound into ragged pieces. The barn door slammed like a verdict and a post went loose, and for a moment the world narrowed to the immediacy of survival. Halters, frantic hooves, a colt that had tangled itself into the hatch. Martha was already there, the pale cream of her traveled dress smeared with wind-driven grit, the V-shaped bodice and the neat row of small buttons outlined in a film of dust, dark brown hair in long, voluminous waves whipping from beneath the straw bonnet tied with its wide ribbon, her massive body a moving bastion against the chaos. She did not hesitate, where townsfolk might have counted and fled. She stepped into the horse's panic with arms that knew how to hold and hands that had tended more fragile lives than a colt's. The ribbon under her chin beat like a flag in the storm and she squinted against the grit, every motion measured and precise. She looped a rope with a practiced hand, anchored a frightened mare to a spare post with the calm of someone who has mended more than cloth, and she pushed where panic wanted only to pull. Eli watched, not surprised but unsettled in an old way. There is a particular kind of courage that is not loud, that does not announce itself with medals or speeches, and Martha's courage was of that sort, unceremonious, unshouting, a steadying force that did the work of bravery without asking anyone to witness it. Together they ran as the storm claimed the corrals, their movements complementary as if choreographed by necessity, Eli hauling a broken plank, Martha pressing a rope into hands that would otherwise have trembled. The fences that gave had to be rebuilt with hands slick from rain and sweat, and at one point a fool bolted toward the arroyo in her voice, sharp, commanding, cut through the wind, a human call that corralled wild motion into a path. In those minutes, when the ranch was a rapid of terror and action, the town's old whisper about her size evaporated like dust in the rain. Muscle and will mattered more than measurements, and Martha's mask became leverage and a shelter. The rumor moved faster than a stagecoach and twice as eager, a small, eager thing that found purchase in the saloon smoke in the barber's soap-scraped mirror. She's living with him, someone said as if this were scandal or spectacle, and Red Hollow's appetite for both sharpened like a blade. Mouths that had laughed at the returned envelope now sharpened their tongues to new shapes, fancying herself a ranch mistress, taking advantage of a kind-hearted fool, would last a fortnight in the saloon, which had once turned Martha Lynn into an exhibit of ridicule, reassembled itself into a theater of renewed cruelty, the lamplight catching smirks and the clink of glasses punctuating someone else's verdict. Martha heard it all as she passed through town on errands, the pale cream of her travel dress catching light and dust in equal measure, the fitted V-shaped bodice buttoned neat down the center as if order could be kept even when the world insisted otherwise, dark brown hair flowing in long, voluminous waves that framed a face set with a patience born of repeated trials, the straw bonnet tied under her chin with a wide cream ribbon whose tails fell against the front of her bodice like a banner of quiet persistence. She moved with the economy of someone who had learned to carry attention without letting it tilt her, hands steady, skin fair against the dust, and when whispers curled after her like smoke she did not shout or plead. She kept the returned letter folded in its secret pocket and let work answer where words might fail. The town's core sought confirmation, and men who had never lifted a hayfork in earnest widened their voices to fill the whole of their own smallness. But the rumor settled differently in Eli Carter's chest, where others saw impropriety. He saw a ledger of work completed, and he was tired of the town's talent for moral accounting that valued appearance above labor. So when the saloon's laughter rose that night, sharp, hungry, a practiced thing meant to unmake a person, Eli did what he seldom did. He stood and walked to the bar, his boots hitting the boards with a sound that made talkers pause, and his voice, usually flat as prairie earth, carried a weight that made even the barkeep look up. "You talk like men without hands," he said, quiet but clean as a snapped wire, and the sentence cut the saloon's noise because it refused their rhythm. He let the words hang, then added, "She's done more honest work in a week than most of you have all year." The room changed in that breath, a tilt, not immediate conversion, but a thud of conscience where laughter had been practiced. Faces that had smirked now found themselves without script, and the laughers' mouths closed as if the air itself now judged them. It was not a triumphant speech. Eli was not that kind of man. His defense had no flourish, no public sermon, only the blunt moral arithmetic of a man who lived by hands and tools. She woke at dawn. She kept ledgers straight. She tended beasts with a steadiness that saved time and money, and she mended more than fences. She steadied the rhythm of a ranch that feeds town and man alike. The saloon's mockery wilted into a quieter, grudging calculation. Respect, reluctant and raw, seeped in through the cracks, and men who had once considered her an object of ridicule now counted the cost of their words against the work she had done. In the corners, older women, those who had scrubbed the town's floors when illness took husbands and sons, nodded with the slow recognition of those who understand that dignity is earned in labor rather than pronounced in style. Children watched, their lessons shifting from the childish cruelty taught by elders to the more complicated ledger of human decency. Martha, hearing Eli's words, felt a small release, not vindication exactly, but the easing of a pressure she had carried like a stone in her pocket. She did not parade his defense. She did not bask in it. She simply kept walking, the ribbon beneath her chin fluttering faintly as if it, too, had relaxed. The town would take time to undo its habit of measuring worth by narrow standards, and gossip would resurface in other forms because Red Hollow loved its stories like farmers love rain. When it came it could drown. When it didn't it baked the soil hard. But the immediate ledger had been altered. A man with hands had named the work done, and naming matters in a place that tallies reputations as if they were coins. That night the saloon's rafters held a different sound, not the clean laughter of mockery, but low, uneasy conversations, the beginnings of reckonings. Outside, the wind moved the dust along Main like a slow hand erasing a small part of the town's cruelty, and in the quiet that followed, respect, new, reluctant, and dangerous in its freshness, settled like a thin rain over Red Hollow, changing the math of lives that thought themselves fixed. Martha was folding a deep cloth by the stove when the drawer gave up a small, folded envelope as if it had been waiting for the exact right moment to be found. It slid free beneath an old ledger with a soft, final sound and lay on the wood like a thing that had been mislaid in someone else's life. She paused, fingers still, because there are kinds of paper that announce sorrow the way some weather announces storm, an edge softened by handling, ink brown where tears might once have blurred it, and the handwriting on the front held a familiar cadence, the same careful curl, the same way the pen pressed harder on certain downstrokes, a private rhythm that reads like memory if you know how to look. The name was hers no more. The envelope was addressed to a woman whose photograph Martha had once glimpsed in Eli's parlor, a woman with a dress pinned at the throat, eyes solemn in sepia, and the sight of that name set a small, peculiar twinge through Mark like the echo of a bell rung somewhere distant. She did not stand and call Eli. She did not fling the drawer open to demand story and confession. Instead, she held the envelope for a heartbeat as if feeling for warmth, then slid the corner beneath her thumb and broke the seal with the slow care of someone untying a knot that must not be frayed. The paper unfurled into other paper, a letter inside, folded twice, the ink a map of sorrow in a hand that had once wanted to make sense of a loss. Martha read in the lamplight and found sentence after sentence that carried the hush of a man speaking to a woman who was no longer there. Small, domestic things, how the chores stacked in the winter, a mention of a place they once walked, a line about a name for a colt that had been born and lived only a few days, the intimate inventory of a life lived in halves and then catalogued into memory after the half was gone. This sorrow in that handwriting matched something she carried herself, a steady, underlying ache that was not theatrical but honest, the kind that reshapes a person's edges until new shapes have to be learned. She folded the letter back into its envelope and did not hide it. Instead, she smoothed the paper and set it on the table as if placing a fragile thing where it might be noticed. When Eli came in later, boots thudding, jacket still smelling faintly of saddle and rain, he glanced at the envelope and then at her, and for a moment there was a measurement between them as tangible as the ledger on the shelf. He did not ask where she had found it. He did not snatch it up as a secret to be reclaimed. Instead, he took off his hat and hung it on the peg, the motion polite and large, and their silence widened into something new, thicker, less performative. The presence of his wife's name on that neat flap of paper did not require questions to make it real. It was a truth that settled like dust. Every home has dust. Every life has the sediment of memory, and now the sediment was laid where they lived and ate. Martha felt, in that hush, a kinship she had not expected. The letter gave her access not to gossip but to the interior architecture of Eli's grief, and the revelation changed how she regarded the quiet man who had offered her work at a plate. His loneliness was not an absence she could cure, but a shape she could respect. She folded the corners of the letter with the same care she gave to mending clothes and set it near the kettle as if it were a small relic, something to be tended without needing to be explained. Over the next days the envelope sat where they could both see it, neither secret nor spectacle, and their conversations altered in small ways. They spoke more about the absent woman not as an accusation but as a fact of history, a shared geography. Eli would mention, once, how his late wife liked the window seat in winter, how she would slice apples thin for pies and hum without thinking, and Martha would reply with a detail she had noticed in a photograph, and in that exchange the silence between them softened into human scale. The hidden letter had done what quiet can do when it is honored instead of used as gossip. It had made them real to one another. No dramatic confessions followed, no sudden declarations of intimacy. Instead, the revelation rearranged their days in modest ways, a cup set out for two, stories shared by the stove in lower voices, an occasional pause when one of them would touch the envelope and remember. The sorrow in the handwriting was a mirror for Martha's own private bruises, and seeing that mirrored her in another man's careful script made the distance between them manageable, human, fixing their relationship not on pity but on the honest, slow work of living with past loss. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right, the night pressed in like a blanket, thick, dark, threaded with sparks from the stove, and for the first time since the returned envelope had folded her into Red Hollow's story, Eli spoke in a way that felt like opening a door in a closed house. I lost her to fever. Never thought I'd need anyone again. The words were small and plain, the kind that are true because they do not gild themselves. They landed between them and did not demand anything extravagant in return, only the attention of a person who knows what absence tastes like. Martha sat opposite him, the pale cream of her travel dress dimmed by lamplight, the fitted bodice and B-shaped waistline making a modest punctuation on the long line of the afternoon. Dark brown waves falling over her shoulders and catching the firelight in little, honest glints. The straw bonnet lay on the table like a soft punctuation mark, its cream ribbon untied and tails draped across the wood, and her hands folded in her lap in the practiced way of someone who has kept house and kept herself through hard weather. She did not rush to fill the spaces confession made. Instead, she offered presence, the rare kind that listens not to answer but to be changed by what it hears. And the room felt the change as if a window had been opened and a cool thing stepped inside. Eli's voice kept its flatness, the flatness of a man who has measured grief in days and feats of labor rather than soliloquy. He spoke of small things first, the way she would carve the bread, the crooked chair she preferred in winter, how she'd hum off-key while boiling beans, details that kept a person alive in memory the way a photograph keeps light. When he said fever, the syllable carried a tremor like the echo you hear after a bell has stopped ringing. It was not theatrical. He did not lay out the whole map of heartbreak. He offered instead the coordinates and let the listener find the rest. Martha's eyes glimmered in that firelit hush, not with tears, but with a recognition that was almost anatomical. Loss is a language some people learn to speak in silence, and she read his meaning as one reads a familiar road sign at night. Her own history, doors closed in stations, letters sent back, the ache of being ordered and summarily returned, had taught her the shape of grief. She saw, in the small stack of sentences he had set beside the kettle, the same tilt that had tilted her life. She did not reply at once with counsel or consolation. She replied with a sentence that arrived as if from a different room in her house. Then maybe you don't need anyone. The line paused like a held breath, and Eli's expression tightened as if he were weighing that claim, expecting a bitter or practical finish. But her voice smoothed into the room like steady water as she finished. Maybe you just deserve someone. The second half of the sentence was not the kind of alms the town had offered her, no charity in its grain, but a different currency, the assertion that suffering does not disqualify one from being wanted, that solitude is not always the same as worthlessness. It was a simple moral reckoning, a quiet rebalancing of ledgers, and it landed with a softness that did not diminish its force. Eli listened, and something in his face shifted, old armor loosened by the slow, steady insistence of a truth he had not permitted himself to hold, that need and deserving could coexist without canceling each other. The fire popped as if to punctuate the moment, and outside the land stretched dark and honest. Inside, the small kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the faint, domestic taint of apples drying on a string. They spoke then, low and fitful, their voices keeping to the dimensions of practical intimacy. A memory of a pie crust, a small confession about occult stubbornness, a remark about the years since the war that had left Eli with an oldness in his bones. Their words were not a torrent but a steady creek that would, given time, carve a channel through the hard land of solitude. In that exchange Martha learned not only the map of his loss but the places where his defenses still stood, and Eli learned the architecture of her endurance, how she had learned to stand when doors closed, how she had kept herself from breaking by practicing small, useful tasks that stitched life together. There was a moral quiet to the way they built these stories together, not dramatic reconciliations but an accumulation of small truths that, like piled stones, would in time make a wall of company. At one point Eli reached across the table and, with a gesture unpracticed and therefore honest, he set the unopened letter addressed to his late wife backward in view. The act said more than a speech about memory ever could. He was not hiding pasts from her. He was making them part of their shared room. Martha touched his hand with the same plain bravery with which she tended the barn when storms came. No flourish, no claim, only a practical steadiness that promised to stay. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of things being rearranged softly into their right places, and as the fire narrowed to embers and the night outside held its breath, both of them found a small, dangerous comfort. Two people who had been made small by loss could, by simply witnessing one another, become large again. Seasons shifted on Eli's ranch with a lazy insistence of weather that waits for no opinion. Summer's hard light softened into gold that dusted everything and then waned into the pale hush of autumn. And with each passing month, the sharp edges of their early days rounded like stones turned by a patient river. Martha learned the land's grammar as if she had been born with a plow in her hands. Mornings mapped into a ledger of chores, mending shirts, stoking the stove, counting feet, naming each mare and colt as if naming made them less wild, and evenings gathered them back at the stove for bread and honest talk. She was massive in a way that changed how the world had to make room for her. Dark brown hair fell in long, voluminous waves around her face and over her shoulders. The pale cream travel dress with its fitted bodice and V-shaped waist and the neat line of small buttons holding itself like punctuation. The straw bonnet with a modest brim and wide cream ribbon tied under her chin framing her light skin. All of it becoming part of the ranch's new silhouette. Work softened into companionship not with thunder but by quiet, repeated mornings. Eli noticed the way she hummed while she scrubbed a pan, the way she balanced a sack of feed without complaint. The economy of her movements in the rain when a colt balked, and in the watching he learned a vocabulary of small mercies. How she straightened a coat on a fence post as if placing a child's jacket. How she repaired a saddle strap with the patience of someone mending a long injury. Companionship, in that slower rhythmic, became affection. A brush of hands loading a wagon, a shared laugh over a botched pie crust, an evening where they both reached for the same cup and neither yielded. These were not the flourish of novels, but the real currency of lives fused by habit. The rhythm of life lightened the way dawn light makes colors truer. Mornings were less like choices and more like promises kept. The scars of the town's rejection did not vanish. They sank inward and smoothed. But they were replaced by a sturdier thing, belonging. Children who once peered at her with the narrow lessons of gossip now waved from the fence as if she were a neighbor who had always been there. Men who had once spat small judgments now tipped hats in a calculation that had been altered by witnessing labor. Martha's laughter came more often, not because she had forgotten the past, but because the ranch offered her work worthy of the dignity she carried within. Eli's defenses softened not in a single brave scene, but in the accumulation of tiny trust, leaving a tool where she could find it, calling her name without preface, bringing an extra biscuit in the morning because he knew she liked brown sugar. In the evenings they spoke of small things, the weather, the stubbornness of a mare, a memory of a wife or mother, and those conversations, modest and true, acted like mortar that set their days into a shelter. Visual cues of their changing life were small and cinematic. This slow zoom on a shared elbow as they mended a fence together. The dark to light transition as breakfast ended and work began. The rise of a new sun that felt almost like applause. There were delayed reveals too. Town gossip would sometimes flicker like a dying lamp, but the parallel story of two people who had been judged and then chose to keep showing up grew louder in its own way. The moral shift was not declared but demonstrated, respect earned by labor, tenderness grown by patience. By the time winter threatened, the ranch was less a solitary post than a small world of mutual tending. Belonging, once a fragile seed, had taken root and offered them both a shelter as quiet and inevitable as the turn of the seasons. Months had arranged themselves into a quiet ledger of days when, one late afternoon, a shadow from the past rode into Red Hollow with the slow arrogance of regret sewn into the seams of his coat. Samuel Pike's horse came up the track with a rider whose posture said he had thought better of haste and worse of consequence, and the town's loose gossip, always hungry for a spectacle, leaned and like a thing that expects a predictable story. He dismounted with hands that lingered on the saddle as if reluctant to let go of an idea. And when he crossed the yard toward the ranch, he found Martha Lynn in the work of the place, massive in body and large in presence, dark brown hair tumbling in long, voluminous waves over her shoulders, the pale cream travel dress dirt smudged at the ham or duty had met the land, the fitted bodice and its V-shaped waistline and the neat row of small buttons holding themselves like punctuation. A straw bonnet tied with a wide cream ribbon under her chin whose tails lay against the center of her bodice like a small flag of endurance. Her skin was light and held the faint map of weather and work. and she moved with the honest authority of someone who had been given tasks and had kept them. Samuel looked at her as if his eyes were trying to relearn a map he had once folded and then lost. Regret sat heavy on his face, and there was apology in the way he kept his hat in both hands, the practiced posture of a man who knows he has asked for what he did not deserve. He spoke, words that were hurried and clumsy, as if they wanted to clean themselves by speaking. Forgiveness, second chances, the confession that his expectations had been small and his courage smaller. The townsman's talk had made him a man who bought a promise on paper and then feared the weight of a living one. The ranch yard listened, when contemplating fences, horses turning their heads, and Martha's hands stilled on the workbench. She had learned to be measured in public, to let the town's ledger balance itself out in time, and now the ledger asked a different type of account. Eli, who had watched this approach from where he had been tending a colt, stepped forward not with bluster but with a quiet that carried as much decision as a raised voice. He stepped aside to let Martha speak to the man who had once ordered her as if she were a thing, giving her the space his respect for her demanded. The moment was cinematic without any contrivance. Samuel's apology hung in the air like a petition. The rancher's silence pulled tight, and Martha measured the old man not with the town's small arithmetic but with the long, steady measures of life on the ranch. Did he know how to lift a sack without snapping his back? Did he know how to apologize without asking for a return on the investment? Her voice trembled, not from fear but from the gravity of answering a man who had once reduced her to a line on paper. And when she spoke, the words were precise, stripped of the town's performative cruelty and instead full of the moral clarity she had learned by living honestly. You taught me my worth by refusing to see it. The sentence landed like a verdict that was not vengeance but truth. It held him accountable with a lucidity that made his shoulders dip. Then she turned, and, with the steady kindness she had practiced in the kitchen and barn, added the line that surprised nobody more than Eli. He taught me to never forget it. Those words were not a dismissal of repentance but a redefinition of allegiance. She acknowledged Samuel's role in hardening her, in handing her rejection that became an unlikely teacher, but she also declared where her loyalty had gone. To the man who had given her work without spectacle, who had watched her labor and had named her worth without pity. Samuel's face moved through shades, shame, sorrow, perhaps the faint hope that some doors can be reopened. He asked, in the blunt language of a man asking for what he had earlier discarded, whether she would still consider him, whether a second chance might be granted. Martha's answer was not theatrical. She placed her hands on the rail, felt the grain, and spoke of dignity reclaimed, how one learns to count life not by other people's orders but by the steady work that sustains it. Eli's step back was an offering and a test. It respected her choice without pressuring it. The town watched and learned a small, necessary lesson. Some truths are not made by social theater but by the slow accumulation of mornings. Samuel rode away with a heavier saddle than he'd arrived with, and as his figure shrank into the dusty road the ranch yard exhaled. Martha stood beside Eli, bonnet shadow soft over her face, the cream ribbon at her throat fluttering like a small banner, and between them there was a warmth now, slow grown, risk earned, that transformed rejection into belonging and leveled the town's ledger not by spectacle but by the honest count of work done in love quietly given. The day bent toward its end in a wash of gold that made everything look as if it had been painted with the same soft hand. The fences, the low slope of the pasture, the long shadow of the barn, and Eli and Martha found themselves standing where the land falls away to the river. The ranch laid out behind them like a life they had stitched together by morning and by moonlight. She was massive in presence as ever, dark brown hair in long, voluminous waves spilling over her shoulders, the pale cream travel dress clinging a little at the hem where work had met weather, the fitted bodice and V-shaped waistline and neat line of small buttons keeping a composed front, the straw bonnet now often hanging from her fingers, the wide cream ribbon tied under her chin earlier fluttering loose, its tails falling down the center of her bodice like a badge of what she had endured and become. Her light skin warmed by the last sun, freckles like a map of small kindnesses across her face. They had not needed declarations. The ranch had written their contract in acts rather than speeches, a shared lift of a gate, a cup set without asking, a ledger kept straight. Now, with the sun lowering, Eli's hand found hers in a motion so simple it might have been accidental, calloused fingers closing around broader ones, and the land seemed to hush to listen. There was no clumsy proposal. No ring flashed as a trophy. only the language of two lives finally unafraid to touch. His thumb stroked the back of her hand once, a small, decisive gesture that said more than any order could. The work we have done will be the oath we keep. Around them, the town's roofs and the pale line of Maine could be seen in the distance. Word travels the country roads fast, and Red Hollow had watched several changes. Gossips that once sharpened knives now quieted into a wary respect. But tonight the watching was different. People paused in doorways, a child's laugh trailed off into a thoughtful silence, and even the saloon's talk softened into a low murmur. They watched not with a salacious hunger of spectacle, but with the cautious awe that comes when a stubborn life declares its own terms. The scene was cinematic not because of artifice, but because of the honest choreography of small gestures, the tilt of a head, the way her shoulders softened under his touch, the slight, near imperceptible leaning that two people do when they decide to carry something together. Eli's face, weathered and usually unreadable, eased in its slow way Amanda's when he recognizes a shore after being lost at sea. It was not elation so much as relief, a wide, quiet gratitude that lived in the slackening of his jaw and the light catching the lines of his eyes. Martha's breath caught, not in need but in the recognition of having been seen, truly seen, by someone whose life had matched hers in steady mornings and stormy nights. She did not speak a vow. She had learned vows are often whispered into pots of stew and signed with the practice of returning each day. Instead, she squeezed his hand back, the motion a deliberate contract. And when she looked at him, there was a softness that had been earned by labor and sorrow both. She had been taught her worth by rejection, but taught to keep it by this man who had handed her tasks and then watched her complete them without spectacle. The moral exchange was plain. Where the town had once valued silhouettes, the ranch valued work. Where Samuel Pike had measured her by a paper promise, Eli measured her by mornings. As the sun slid lower, painting the clouds in a ribbon of fire, they turned together toward the house. No one shouted congratulations, and there was no dramatic cheers from the prairie, only the gentle, human sound of doors closing after a day's work, the settling of animals in their stalls, the livestock breathing out the last of the afternoon light. In that quiet procession, Red Hollow's ledger altered itself without ceremony. Neighbors took notes in their own way, and the saloon's barflies found new stories to tell, less about scandal, more about the stubbornness of two people who had rebuilt themselves into a quiet marriage of hands and habits. Eli's hand stayed in hers as if to anchor, as if to say aloud the truth of what had already happened. Two hearts, both scarred and stubborn, finally at peace. The camera of memory would hold the moment, the sun's final bow, the two silhouettes walking home along the fence line, the ribbon catching the last light, and it would be a simple image, cinematic because it was honest, not the applause of a town convinced, but the hush of a life that had chosen itself and, in choosing, called the town to look again. Dawn lifted like a slow breath over Eli's ranch, the sky peeling from indigo to pale gold, and the camera, if the land were a lens, would find them there at the fence line. Martha and Eli side by side, silhouettes softened by morning and the long work that had shaped them. She was massive in presence, dark brown hair loosened from its ponyed into long, voluminous waves that framed her face and spilled over her shoulders. The pale cream travel dress that had once been a tidy armor now marked with the honest smudges of labor, the fitted bodice and V-shaped waistline and neat row of small buttons still registering her effort to make order of a life that had been messy. The straw bonnet hung on a peg back at the house, the wide cream ribbon tied under her chin earlier fluttering now at the corner of her apron like a banner that had been lowered and then raised again. Her light skin catching the first Sanso freckles and the soft map of a life at work glinted for a heartbeat. Together they watched the herd break into motion, horses unloosing themselves across the prairie, manes and tails scouring air into shapes, and the sound, hoofbeats like a low drum, filled the valley with an old, essential music. The wind that had once carried the town's whispered judgments returned to center. Too soft, too much, now came as a different messenger, lifting her hair, pushing the ribbon tails to flutter like a flag. And in that simple movement the story rewrote itself. Laughter rose from Martha, not brittle and defensive but bright and free, the sort of laugh that belongs to someone who has been given space to be whole. It cut across the plain and made the light look kinder, and Eli's mouth curved in a way that had taken months of mutual mornings to unstick. Around them the ranch breathed. A dog shook off water near the corral. A frog tried a clumsy kick and found its feet. A fence creaked in the pleasant way of things that have been fixed and will hold, and in the cadence of those ordinary sounds a moral shift was audible. Small, cumulative, inexorable. Red Hollow's fences of gossip still stood at the town's edges, but their boards looked less like verdicts than they once had. Neighbors who had once tossed words like stones now watched with a different ledger in their faces, a calculation that had been altered by witness and time. No parade arrived. No grand pronouncements were made. The triumph was domestic and stubborn. A woman who had been stamped as an error by paper and then by tongues now moved through space that required effort and gave back sustenance. And the triumph lay in the unremarkable arithmetic of tending and being tended, of bread baked and broken, of shovels lifted in common. Eli's hand found hers across the fence rail, a habitual gesture by now, that touch as casual as a morning, as binding as any vial written in gold. His thumb stroked the knuckles he knew were steady, and she squeezed back, the signal of two lives stitched by work and soft courage. The scene held the device as the land taught them, dark to light transitions that mirror the change in their hearts, a slow zoom on details, a ribbon caught in sunlight, the near smile that used to hide and now showed, the visual metaphor of the rising sun as renewal, the hoof beats as the heartbeat of a frontier that had taught them both hard lessons and harder kindnesses. There was repetition in how they had come to this, repeated mornings, repeated mending, repeated refusals of small cruelties, each repetition a stone in a row that led away from the saloon's laughter and toward a house warming its hearth. The delayed reveal, the town learning by watching rather than lecturing, felt inevitable now, a revelation delivered not by shot but by the slow accumulation of acts. In that light, their victory was not theatrical but moral. A quiet refutation of the idea that worth could be measured by size or by spectra of a paper promise. The ranch measured value in labor, in keeping accounts balanced and animals fed, in being present when storms came. Her laughter rose again, higher, and for a moment the whole prairie seemed to answer. The wind carried it beyond the fence, beyond the town, out over country where maybe other small cruelties lingered, and it took with it the unadorned message: renewal and love can ride on the same breeze that once carried scorn. As they turned to walk back toward the house, their steps in sync, their shadows long and leaning together, a soft voice closed the day on the story in a low, tender register. Sometimes, the frontier breaks you to show what's unbreakable. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.